Hello. So for this section, we'll be looking at Europe primarily, European expansion, kingdoms and empires in Europe, a little bit colonialism into early America, just barely touching on that. But yeah, mostly Europe, peasants, monarchies, things like that. That's generally what we're looking at here in this section. From the years 1500 to 1750, we'll have a couple chapters where we'll be looking at the same time frame in different places in the world. All right, 17th century crisis and rebuilding. So, crisis among peasants and the urban poor. This was a time of a little ice age that hit Europe for decades. We end up with a cooler, a wetter climate. This created food shortages, made it much harder to grow crops. We see, on top of this, a massive economic recession. So we have an economic crisis, we have a food crisis, we have famine, disease rampant through Europe. This was entirely unexpected. There hadn't been an ice age hit Europe for like 6,000 years, a real ice age. And this isn't a one-year thing. This lasts a couple decades, actually. This little climate change before things sort of go back to normal. With less food, we see rising prices, rising costs of food. Of course, that creates increased inflation, little money to purchase goods, and of course, one of the primary occupations of your typical peasant, your typical poor person working in Europe would have been farming. And so many of them can't even farm now. So you have the loss of food, the loss of money, the loss of work, employment. It's pretty bad. We see industry suffer, we see people suffer, widespread unemployment. It's pretty bad. Now, with all of these low wages, we see protests, we have riots, we have people expressing their disgust at the situation. We see theft, reselling of food at what they would call just prices, fair prices. And we do see some beginnings of some ideas of revolution, as we'll talk about later, because typically the rich and wealthy had food. They had stores of food. Kings had stores of food. The monarchy, the royalty, they had stores of food. So, yeah, it's interesting. Difficult in this time, and it gets much more complicated as we go along. Now, for most of Western Europe, they were peasants, which is basically just poor farmers and workers, laborers. But in Eastern Europe, due to this crisis, we actually see a return to serfdom. Serfdom is a version of slavery, really. It's where the peasants are actually tied to the land. They're associated with the land, they have to work the land, they have to pay off their debts, they have to work for the nobility, the kings, the wealthy. So there's also the Black Death, which is a situation in here. The Black Death, the bubonic plague, which killed millions. So we see the Eastern aristocracy, the aristocracy being the wealthy, the nobles. We see them restricting peasants being able to move around. They can't get better opportunities. They're not allowed to elevate themselves to have better work opportunities. Education, of course, is almost non-existent for the poor. They would not have been considered slaves, but it was practically slavery. It was basically no rights, forced marriage. You could actually be sold with the property. So if someone would sell their land, they would sell the peasants, or with serfs, they'd sell the serfs with them. It was pretty bad. No legal rights, selling family members, yeah. So we see a large population decline. We see continual warfare, plague, famine, disease. What this did was this crisis left the power into the hands of the landlords, the wealthy nobility and aristocracy. They gained the ability to basically rule with absolute authority, very little control by the actual populations themselves. Pretty rough. As in any time of crisis, the poor are always the hardest hit. In Europe, that was the vast majority of the population. 80-90% would have been categorized in the poor, lower income category. And the wealthy, the middle income and wealthy, usually do okay, usually survive, especially since they're primarily the ones that control the military. So that gives them a very distinct advantage. Now we'll look at the 30 Years' War, one of the most deadly conflicts in world history. Peace of Augsburg, which was from 1555, which was which would have been part of the early world history course. Peace of Augsburg began to erode. It basically started to come apart as tensions between different religious groups, primarily Protestant groups, Lutheran groups, and Catholic. Now, what was the Peace of Augsburg? It was declared as a peace agreement after the Protestant Reformation between Protestants and Catholics, between Lutherans and Catholics, that both it allowed local regional rulers to decide whether or not their region would be either Protestant, Lutheran, or Catholic. And that was in the previous century. Now this starts to come apart. We see Lutherans forming different groups, Protestants forming different groups. This is basically new generations of people who are not happy with this agreement to where you have like one town or community, one region is Catholics, and then a few miles away those are Protestants, Lutherans, and they don't agree. So we see Lutherans forming the Protestant Union. We see Catholics organized into the Catholic League. All of this basically fears about another war coming, which had happened in the previous when the Protestant Church broke away from the Catholic Church, the beginning of the Protestant Reformation and Lutheranism. These two groups went into combat in a battle known as the Battle of White Mountain. The Battle of White Mountain around 1620. And this was the first of several phases of war of what becomes known as the 30 Years' War, which again, very deadly. Catholics won most of these early battles, and over time, though, we see both sides winning and losing. We have the four phases: Bohemian, Danish, Swedish, and French, which is primarily based upon their geographic location where most of the wars were being fought, where most of the battles were being fought. The Bohemian phase was this first phase. Second, the Danish, Swedish, French. Kings were often involved in this. The different kings. We have Danish kings, Swedish kings, French kings. This was a conflict which, before we would use the term World War, this was sort of an early World War because it involved several of the greatest world powers at the time, colonial powers. It was pretty ugly. The Peace of Westphalia ended that conflict. That happened 1648, about 30 years later. It established authority in the region of Central Europe to 300 different princes. These are small mini-kings, if you will, regional leaders. And these 300 princes had all the power and authority in each of their regions, instead of having all the power going to basically the Holy Roman Emperor, which was the leader of the German Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. It takes power away from him. And the reason it happens is probably more than anything a belief that the Holy Roman Emperor, the German Emperor, wasn't able to maintain peace in his empire. He just wasn't effective. And so these approximately 300 little mini kings took over their own regions and decided for themselves, their own little kingdoms, decided for themselves how to run it. That Peace of Augsburg Agreement was reinstated in 1555, from 1555 was reinstated, which again stated that both Protestant and Catholic could be official religions all through Central Europe. Each of the different regions, again, got to decide on their own whether they wanted to worship Catholic or wanted to worship Protestant. Calvinism is a new one. Calvinism becomes a new religious faith, which it does fall under the Protestant banner, just like Lutheranism falls under the Protestant banner. All of these faiths are part of this Protestant Reformation from the previous century. A new recognition for Calvinism, which is significant. We'll talk more about it later because Calvinism is influential upon, American history, for instance. All right. During this period of war, we see an approximate decline of 40% of the entire European population. That's unbelievable. Tens of millions, maybe 100 million to 125 million people dead. Now, it wasn't just due to the war. We also have the Ice Age going, the Little Ice Age. We have the famine, the strife, the unemployment, poverty levels across the board. This is one of the most worst times in European history as far as to live there, to be a poor peasant or serf. It's really bad. The greatest, perhaps the greatest single incident of human loss of life, not necessarily as a result of natural causes. Basically, yes, the Ice Age was a big part of it, but it was just as much human causes as well. Pretty bad. So see, this shows you a map here after the 30 Years' War. We're going to talk a little bit about Austria, which is the green. We're going to talk about the Spanish, other German states, Swedish lands, Ottoman Empire, the Great Muslim Empire is still strong at this point in time. This gives you an idea of what we're talking about here and how this entire area of Central Europe, which primarily becomes mostly Germany and Prussia, in later years, it gives you an idea where all this is happening, all this violence and destruction. Okay. 17th century crisis rebuilding continued. Achievements in state building. All right. So after all this happens, we see an increase in centralized power in many places, in many folks. Kings, royalty, different dynasties, they want to consolidate their power due to this massive upheaval. We see the power-hungry people do really well in a power vacuum. When you don't have a centralized power authority and it's all small, decentralized, all these small little rulerships, that leaves holes to where someone can come in and start picking them off one at a time, someone who is a strategic mind, powerful enough to actually come in and sort of grab up all these smaller empires and smaller kingdoms. Constitutional governments join absolutist governments. We see both these types of governments. Generally, Western Europe are more constitutional governments, based on some type of a rule of law, constitution, type of a document that protects the people. France, England, for instance, Spain even. And then we generally see Eastern Europe more absolutist. Typically more absolute, basically all the power in the hands of one person, one authority, absolute power in the hands of a king or an emperor. These are really the two major governmental systems we see emerge in Europe in this time. Both of these are centralized power, though. Both of these put the power in the hands of a ruler, a ruling elite. One gives more power to the people. Constitutional gives more power, more rights, and more responsibilities to the people. Absolutist governments are less so. Very important things that you need to do and control to have a powerful centralized government. You have to have a national tax system. You have to have a powerful military and policing system. You have to have a large bureaucracy, government, and you have to get obedience of the people, either voluntary through constitutional governments where people feel like they're more involved and they're more willing to allow themselves to be governed, or the other way, which is forced obedience in more totalitarian type governments. So 17th century states, they approached total sovereignty. Total sovereignty, total power and authority over the population and their own borders. Now, they didn't achieve it. Why couldn't they achieve it? You understand things were much more limited back then. It took days or weeks to travel, to get communication. Something could happen in one region of an empire that literally could take months, even years, to get to the other side. There was nothing instantaneous. No instantaneous transport. It could take weeks or months just to travel between cities. So their authority was strong of the centralized power, but it's still limited. Even the centralized government was still limited due to these constraints of transportation, communication. And of course, you still have lots of local authorities that are unwilling to, quote unquote, bend the knee to a more supreme king or emperor or ruler. Sometimes obedience has to be forced. It's not voluntary. Specifically here, talk about absolutism in France and Spain. So in this section, we're going to look at absolute rule in Western Europe, where the power is typically in the hands of one person or one authority. Let's look at France. Really, we're looking at France here first. Cardinal Richelieu was the first minister of France. He served the Queen of France, who headed the French government. Now, the actual king was Louis XIII. Was actually the king. But his mother, which we would call like a queen regent, the mother was the one that sort of ruled. Again, he was 9. So he really, the queen is who made a lot of the decisions. But the official power was Richelieu. The real official power was a cardinal, was a Catholic cardinal, was really the authority behind it for Louis XIII. Now, what Richelieu wanted was to be the one in power. He wanted to have full control. He didn't want the mother to make decisions. He didn't want the soon-to-be actual king to make decisions, so he made most of the decisions himself. He wanted to ensure that France was Catholic, so he repressed Protestants. He increased taxes, increased royal authority, wanted absolute power for himself, not even really the Catholic Church. He really wasn't working on, even though he did openly appear to be working at behest of the Catholic Church, in service to the Catholic Church. It was really about his own personal power. Really about his own personal power and authority. The main goal was to weaken Austria, because Austria was a neighboring country, and they had border disputes. And so weaken Austria, increase France's power, get more land, territory, money, while also enriching himself. You can see by his painting down there in the bottom, that is a painting of Richelieu, that he obviously thought a lot of himself. He obviously thought a lot of himself and his power and authority. Now, his successor to Richelieu was Cardinal Mazarin. He succeeded Richelieu, continued his centralizing policies. He also was considered first minister, because by this point in time, the Queen didn't really have the power of the Queen Regent. Louis had grown up a little bit. He was a teenager. And Mazarin, though, still was the one that really was making the decisions. Really the one who was really in charge, making all the decisions, because he was still a young man. Louis XIII didn't really have... Many people still saw him as a boy. Even though he was becoming a young man, they still saw him as a boy. And because the Catholic Church was so prominent in France and had basically been running the government for so many years, people simply were okay with it. It was simply accepted that the cardinals would continue to make most of the decisions. Now, Mazarin's efforts to meet the debt, because France had gone... Basically France, we haven't mentioned it yet, but France was in continuous warfare. France was always at war with someone, whether it was the Spanish, the English, the Austrians. They were always at war with someone. Continual warfare. And why is that significant? Because continual warfare drained the treasury. Because you had to pay for all the soldiers, you had to pay for all the supplies, you had to pay bribes, you had to supply all that and provide all the weapons and armor and horses. You had to pay the nobles who went out and fought, the knights. It got expensive. And due to constant debt and the fact that France basically ran out of money through this constant warfare, also the 30 Years' War in the same time period, he increased taxes, tried to increase revenues for the country. We see protests, we see riots. All of this is in response. It's known as the Fronde. This is the response to all of this. The protests, the riots, the challenges to the cardinal and the absolute power of France. Really because of the oppressive authority that France was pushing down on the French. Because who had to pay all the taxes was the commoners, the peasants, the regular folks. French population wasn't happy. We see increased royal control. it gets pretty ugly. It even gets to the point that Louis has to actually flee the country. He has to run away because he fears that he's going to actually be arrested and or killed or beheaded, which they do some of that in this time period. They do, it's interesting. The poor people, regular folks, peasants, would be hung, but that was thought to be insulting to do that to people of station and status, so they beheaded them. Beheading was thought to be more appropriate. It's really interesting. Because when you were hung, you were left out in public. Like, they would hang you and just leave you hanging there for days. Because the point of the hanging is it's a way of indicating to criminals that this is what happens to you. You commit a crime, this is what we do to you. You break the law, you go up against the government. But people who had status and prestige, when they had to be executed, they wanted a quick, simple, to-the-point execution, which was supposed to be, I guess, more honorable or something. Anyway, Louis did flee the country eventually and does return a few years later. Now, Louis XIV took the throne. I apologize. The 13th took the throne in 1661. Takes the throne in 1661 when Mazarin dies. So we do finally get the actual king in charge. Now, he believed in this divine right, this divine rule, this divine right. Sort of the idea that the king was chosen by God. The king was actually chosen by God to rule and to have authority over the mortal world, us, the French citizens. This divine right of rule. And I do, yeah, I believe this is actually Louis XIV now. So it is the 14th, not the 13th. I apologize. The Estates General was formed. It's really interesting about the Estates General. It's like what we have here, like the Congress. It's like we have, Congress, which it's supposed to represent all the different estates, which the estates of the church, the peasants, the nobility. That's what they would call them, sort of the classes. It's sort of a term we might think of like classes. The peasants, the nobility, the church, the different classes of society. That's the estates. And so the Estates General was supposed to represent all classes, all parts. The church, the royalty, the nobles, the aristocrats, the peasants, the working class. And this was the governing assembly. Now, this was called and brought together and assembled. This was sort of the ruling body of France. Now, here's the real interesting thing. The only way it could actually be assembled is if the king assembled it. So what kings often did is they would never call. That was how it was written into the law. The only way you actually bring the ruling body together to make decisions and make laws and policies is if the king decides to do it. How convenient. So if the king doesn't want anyone to come up and say laws or policies or make any changes, then you don't get to do that. Quite interesting. So the king could not do it if he chooses. He rarely ever did this because he didn't want anyone challenging his authority. He didn't want anyone challenging his power or authority. All right. He continued the policies, well, I guess the policies is the best way to put it. Continued the traditions of Richelieu and the Catholic Church. Louis XIV, he also repressed Protestants. He basically pushed down Protestants, didn't want Protestants having any sort of power or authority. And he made it clear to everyone in France that the real power was the king and the Catholic Church side by side, this partnership, which actually is incredibly successful for France. France today is still considered to be a Catholic nation, primarily Catholic. It is a nation that has gone side by side with the Catholic Church and has probably been one of the most strongest supporters of the Catholic faith since the Reformation in the 1500s. Well, since then, for the last 500 years. It's quite interesting. There he is. There's the 14th. That's some hair, isn't it? That's quite a hairdo going on there. I like that. It's an interesting image if you look at this. You need to look at this and think about what elements here indicate his power and authority. First of all, his opulence in the way he's dressed and his attire and his hair, and they wear makeup. The men wore makeup back then. He's got makeup on. And all of this indicates his status and wealth. The color purple, only royalty could wear the color purple. It was known as royal purple, so there's that. We have the fleur-de-lis, which is this symbol you see, the fleur-de-lis, which is a symbol of the French monarchy. Some other interesting things about this is, like, what things are represented by this? What all is in this? Well, the power in France was church and state. The military, royal power, and then also the religious power. This exemplifies both. He's got the sword, the jeweled hilt and the sword on his side, which indicates his authority over the military, the army. But in his right hand, he actually has his hand on a scepter. And a scepter was an actual implement carried by the priests. So this indicates in the painting his authority over both the church and the state, the actual civilian government, the military, and the religious authority. All of it. It represents, he has all of this in his image. He was very fond of this painting, apparently. If you think about the aspects of his personality that might be shown in here, he was considered to be sort of a master manipulator, a little bit of amusement in his look. He was seen to be someone quite effective, actually. He was in power for many years, and he was seen as a really effective absolute leader, which is really interesting. On the surface, it appeared that it was sort of constitutional, because you had the Estates General, they had laws, etc. written down. But here's the problem. Because he's the only one who could call them, he never actually brought the government out. He did everything himself. He was an absolute monarch on what might have been considered sort of a constitutional government, but it never was in effect because of his ability to pretty much keep it from ever really taking effect. Quite interesting. Okay. Now we're going to look at life at Versailles, which was the royal... Paris was sort of the center of France, but the actual royal capital was Versailles. This is where the royal palace was. This is where the royalty stayed. It was the most heavily defended part of France to protect the royal line. All right. He established a really interesting set of royal etiquette, rituals that began at the start of every day, and all these rituals had to be performed every day in and around him, literally from the time he woke up to the time he went to bed. Rules for clothing and how you walked and how you spoke and where you sit. And he forced the nobility, all the nobles, the thousands of nobles, all the royal people that have titles and own land, forced them to basically bow down to him and to sort of almost serve him to get the king's favor. And I mean literally, some of them... Not kidding, there's royalty that would come in. Rich, wealthy people that would wipe his butt. Yes. Carry his chamber pot out, who would actually bathe him. You think servants would do this, and while I'm sure servants did, sometimes other royal people would actually come in and do these things for him. To him. Specifically to get his favor. And he did this. He did this on purpose to sort of humiliate them, to show his power over them, his authority over them, and they would do it in return for favors. More land, more territory, more soldiers protecting their particular home, whatever. It was all about the idea of this patronage, which is based on the Roman. So much of Europe is based upon the Roman and the Romans and how they established the system of patronage. Similar to what was in ancient times. You had to do this for access to the king, access to privileges, to positions, to titles, to wealth. He forced these nobles, he forced the aristocrats in France to, well, basically to cooperate. He wielded power, and he pretty much controlled everything about whether they had status, wealth, authority. How did he get away with all this? To us today, it doesn't make any sense. But how he got away with it is because there's sort of a three-way thing, a system working here. One, he claims divine right, the fact that God actually gave him the power to rule. Many people believe this. Many people believed it. Many royalty, many commoners believed it. Second, he had the power of the military backing him up. The power of the military, this idea of divine right. The church sort of goes hand in that. The Catholic Church fully supported him, and some could argue that the most powerful institution in all of Europe was the Catholic Church. More powerful than any emperor, any king, any country. And the Catholic Church fully supported Louis and fully supported France. So between the church, the military control, the fact that many people did indeed believe in divine right, believe that he was actually handpicked by God to rule. And I suppose you could even add another in there, he controlled the money. He had total and complete control over the wealth and the money of France, of the entire French economy and government. So he could say a word and you'd be a peasant, or you could say a word and you would be rich. It was entirely up to his whim. There is one really interesting and maybe good thing that does come out of Louis. He was a patron of the arts. We see sculptures and paintings and museums created, and we see an increase in music and literature. He was truly someone who believed that his legacy would be art and his idea of culture. He did really have this belief that the French were the most cultured people in Europe. Truthfully, probably true. To be the highest class was to be among the French nobility. The fanciest clothes, the fanciest parties, the greatest architecture and construction and music and literature. It really was sort of the center of this cultured learning and life for all of Europe. And many people did. From lots of other countries, they would send their children for the best education. We even do this day, people get sent to different places, different schools, because you want your kids to have the best school, the best education, especially, if you can afford to send them to private schools and the best universities. People did that back then. The place, if you had the status and you had the means, you sent your children to be educated in France. Best culture, best education, that was the way to do it. All right, Louis XIV, it should be noted that almost his entire time as emperor, was warfare. Pretty much, he sat on the throne for something like 40 years. I don't have the exact dates here, but something like 40 years he sat on the throne. His entire time as king, basically France was at war. Very interesting. Initially successful. Initially, he had a lot of success expanding his borders. He gained commercial centers. He gained land, territory, mines, wealth, forests in places like Netherlands and Germany. The French army tripled in size. And it should be noted that by this time period, the French were probably thought to be the most powerful army in all of Europe. No one was the challenge of the French army. It was so big that by the end of Louis's time in office, the French army alone numbered something like 2 million people. Massive. I mean, even by modern standards, it was a massive military. If the French were coming, you were screwed. Because for first 2 decades of his time an emperor or king, depending on how you want to look at it, they won a lot and took a lot of territory and greatly expanded the borders of France. Constant wars of expansion. He became indirectly involved in they were sort of the military example, which is interesting to note because in the American Revolution, our military was sort of fashioned on the French military. We had actually French and Germans come over and train the American Revolutionary soldiers. France assisted us in the war, all that kind of stuff. So they were seen as the example of the best military in the time period. The French monarch became directly involved in the War of Spanish Succession to decide the ruler of Spain when Charles II died. Charles II was the King of Spain. He died with no children. That was always a recipe for disaster. Because typically, when a monarch died, it was usually passed to their kids, passed to one of their children, usually the eldest male. When a monarch died with no successors, no children, wow, it almost always resulted in warfare, violence, civil war. This became known as the War of Spanish Succession, which eventually ends with the Peace of Utrecht, which actually allowed Louis's own grandson to move in and take over the Spanish throne. Quite interesting. Now, there was an agreement that was forced, actually written into the law of France and Spain, that the countries would never combine. This was the only way it was agreed upon by both peoples, both monarchs, both the royalty, nobility in both France and Spain, that they would not combine their countries for a fear of creating an empire that would be too powerful, too great. France also gave up territories to England, and this basically ends French expansion. But it is actually quite interesting because we end up with an alliance between Spain and France. They don't combine, but they do create this alliance, which makes them combined the two most powerful empires in Europe. France was primarily still in Europe with their military and their power, and then Spain was actually big into overseas expansion. Spain had already expanded. Pretty much all the Americas by this time was under the control of some of the Spanish Empire. So Spain had international power and expansion, huge navies. France had huge armies, and both of them were incredibly wealthy. It could be argued globally, internationally, if you look at the whole world, the most powerful empire in the world was probably Spain. If you look at it as a global issue, in this time period, it was probably Spain. Because they controlled pretty much all of the Americas. North, Central, and South America was almost all in the hands of the Spanish, some of the French. Louis dies in 1715. When he does finally die, it becomes quite clear France is bankrupt. Most of the country is starving. Constant warfare. Again, France did it. Powerful wealth, they spend it all on warfare and expansion, and who pays the price? The peasants. Constant warfare, millions starving, France bankrupt. Yeah, quite interesting how it all works and what it all means. This gives you an idea of what it looks like. France and Spain, had they really combined, France and Spain would have been an unstoppable power, Europe and globally. But most believed had France and Spain tried to combine their monarchies, the rest of Europe would have probably risen up and come after them. It would have forced the Holy Roman Empire, it would have forced England, all of these other countries would have had to declare war. Because they would have been simply too powerful had the two come together. Excuse me. Alright, the decline of absolutist Spain. Spain had used up most of its wealth as well. Same thing. They'd used up most of their wealth with all these New World colonies. When we say New World, we're talking about the Americas. They're New World colonies. They had all kinds of silver mines in the 15 to 1600s. And these silver mines were basically running dry. It was so big that at one point by the mid-1600s, half of the silver in the entire world had simply come from Spanish mines. Although more of those mines, primarily in the Americas, which had made Spain incredibly wealthy. The mines were drying up, riches weren't coming in, they were coming in much slower. We also, of course, see disease and depopulation, because as many people are aware, when the Europeans showed up in the Americas had, 50 to 100 million Native Americans, and within a few, 2 centuries, they were almost all dead. It wasn't warfare. Warfare isn't what killed most of these Native Americans. It was disease. It was the infections and disease the Europeans brought. Europeans had these diseases around forever and were mostly immune or resistant. The Native Americans did not. So Europeans showed up. Literally all the Europeans had to do was breathe on them. Just breathe on them and interact with the Native Americans, and they just started dying off. Entire towns, villages, dying off by the millions. And who was it that worked all these mines? It was the Native American. It was the Indians that worked the mines. So as the Indians died off, the mines run out, they run out of workers, it becomes a real problem for Spain. Difficult. The aristocracy couldn't curb their habits. They lived very rich, expensive lifestyles, expensive tastes, which meant they had to keep raising the taxes, had to raising the rents on the more poor, the peasant populations, the native populations in America. You combine this with a decrease in the actual production. We see resentment, we see revolts, we see violence, we see population decline. Then on top of that, Spain ended up getting into global wars with the Dutch, global wars with the French. And, yeah, it actually got pretty rough. So by 1700s, we have Spain, which in the 14, 15, and 1600s had been a global power and empire, and, again, one of the most powerful in the world, that by the, early 1700s, Spain was not nearly as powerful. Portugal was lost to them. They lost Portugal, which was a large, basically became independent. Portugal gained independence, became its own separate country. Yeah, so we see the decline of Spain happening through the mid-late 1600s and by early 1700s. Spain is not necessarily any more powerful than any of the other European countries, even though they had been massively wealthy and powerful for many years. So in this section, we're going to be looking at Eastern Europe became consolidated with countries that were led by absolute rulers, absolute power and authority in the hands of one person, with no pretense of having, the different constitutional monarchy or the idea of having an actual governing body beyond the king. The Austrian Habsburgs, Eastern Europe, 1600s. We see monarchs increase their power through constant warfare, suppressing the lower classes, serfdom, slavery, increased taxing. Much of the power the Austrian Empire had was built up under Ferdinand II and Ferdinand III. These were the two biggest monarchs, the ones that really created and consolidated power in this absolute authority. Ferdinand III, for instance, he consolidated power in central government in the German-speaking territories of Austria, Moravia, Bohemia. He had a large standing army, and they actually sought out to eradicate and kill anyone who was a Protestant. Basically, death squads, killing anyone who worshipped Protestant faith who wasn't Catholic. Pretty brutal. By the 1700s, we see a strong eastward push towards the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turkish population and empire, Hungary, Transylvania, and also by force. They removed the Ottoman Turks out of Hungary, out of Transylvania, and pushed them further east. The Ottoman Empire is still strong, but it has been declining for years, decades, maybe even 2 centuries it had been declining. So we see Ottoman Turks pushed further and further to the edge of Europe, still in southeastern Europe, but trying to get them out. Same thing, death squads, wars fought to actually eliminate and kill anyone who wasn't a devout Catholic. Prussia is another absolutist kingdom, another absolutist area. I don't know if some of these would really be thought of as countries. Many of these are really, you have a king with a lot of regional princes which sort of owe allegiance, but to think of them as a country like we think of today with actual defined borders, no. Eastern Europe, there were not often defined borders, so they were very fluid, constantly changing, where one king today owes allegiance to the Austrians, and we have next year he owes allegiance to the Prussians, and then 5 years later he owes allegiance to the Russians. So borders are very fluid here. So we have Frederick William, known as the Great Elector, ruled from 1640 to 88, very long, there almost 50 years. He consolidates his holdings through diplomacy and war, and he creates what we would really refer to as Prussia, this region in Eastern Europe, which later years becomes sort of part of Germany. The nobility and the landowning classes of Prussia, they were known as the Junkers. Odd term. They were the nobility, they were the landowners, they were the aristocrats, the royalty, if you will, associated with the royalty. They accepted Frederick William's taxes. They supported his consolidation of Prussian power and creates a permanent standing army. As Prussia becomes a sort of a unified state, large military, strong leader, central government, and it does become as close as we would call it to what we think of as a country, to an actual independent, military, centralized state, which had to be taken more seriously by neighboring Austrians, the Holy Roman Empire, Russians, and even the French would send delegations. And Prussia becomes quite significant in the late 1700s as an official power in Europe. So you can see here the growth of Austria, Prussia. This is all what is much of what would be modern-day Germany today, for instance. Austrian, we can see Austrian. We can see Prussian territory here. This is Berlin, of course. So all of this is what becomes modern-day Germany. And then you have Russia way over here on the other side of Poland. Anyway, at least the map gives you an idea of what we're looking at here and sort of the territories we're talking about. And if it makes it easier for you, you can, of course, always rewind the video, look back at this, and then have a better idea of the territories we're talking about. Austria, Moravia, Bohemia. You can see all those on the map here. All right. Consolidation of Prussian absolutism. Frederick William, a different one, known as the Soldiers' King. He ruled from 1713 to 40. He established absolute rule, turns Prussia into a military state. He eliminates the parliamentary. He eliminates the actual local rulership. He gets rid of any type of other government, any constitutional government. Boom, gone, all gone. Absolute power in the hands of the king to do anything and everything. No self-rule, no local government. All the princes must owe allegiance and pay homage to him as king, otherwise he would march in his armies to crush them. Prussia was small. It had probably one of the smallest populations in Europe, but it had one of the largest armies, one of the best trained armies, absolute monarch rule, harsh serfdom. The Junkers had authority and power in each of their different territories as local rulers. It was a brutal ruling authority and ruling class. Total absolute power. Quite interesting, we do have actually Prussian generals that come over to train American revolutionary soldiers because of their ability and their skill. Prussian forces moved in and took the territory of Silesia from Austria. They annexed it, as we would call, which basically just means invaded and took it. Annexing is a polite political term. It's nothing polite about annexing. Annexing almost always involves warfare, violence, killing. It's never something nice and simple. Prussia doubles its population, has the best military in Europe, and becomes, by the late 1700s, one of the most powerful countries in all of Europe. It's an interesting little map down there, simple. Prussia taking over Silesia, which doubles their power, doubles their size. They try to take over Saxony as well. Makes them quite a power to be dealt with in Central and Eastern Europe. Mongol rule in Russia and the rise of Moscow. Now, the Mongols, which are Eastern Asian, more closely related to Chinese than probably any other group in this time period, they had ruled Russia for centuries. The Mongols had come in the 1400s and had pretty much ruled northern and central Asia for centuries. Different versions of the Mongols and the Mongol warlords. At one point, the Mongol Empire was the largest empire in history of the world. Still technically is. There's never been an empire that had the same amount of square miles under its authority at one time ever. So the largest empire in history of the world was the Mongol Empire. in that 14th, 15th century time. So, long rule, long authority in Russia and in northern and western Asia under the Mongols. Russia's Ivan III expanded the Principality of Moscow. Moscow, today we know Moscow is a city, but in the time Moscow would have been thought of like a region, like a regional, like a whole area, a whole region was this region of Moscow, what they called a principality. Principality meaning ruled by a prince. Expanded eastward to the Baltic Sea and actually stopped acknowledging the Khan. The Khan was the Mongol king, the Mongol leader. So they started ignoring the Mongol king. Moscow basically decided it would have its own authority, have its own power. Moscow had long been the enforcers. They had been the enforcers in Western Asia. They had basically been the military enforcing hand, the police hand of the Mongols, because Mongol actual leadership from Mongolia was like 7,000 miles away. It was massive distance. So they had to have leadership and authority in Western Asia or Eastern Europe, and that had been the Mongols. So they simply took it upon themselves that they'd been independent and basically ruling and running things for so long, they simply declare independence and they choose to lead themselves. Ivan declared himself an autocrat. Autocrat meaning he had sole power, sole rulership. Also, of course, he specifically chose to leave religion out of it, and religious faith out of it. We don't see religion becoming a significant part of Mongol rule. We don't see it becoming a significant part. We think of as religion as like Western versions of religion, Protestant, Catholic. We don't really see that taking shape under the Ivans, under this what becomes basically a family regime for decades, many decades. They choose to leave divine right out of it. The reason for this is historical. Historically, they had not really had religion play a major part in their ruling authority or their power. They really did sort of have separation of church and state. The government and the religion, church was separate. And secondly, to really owe allegiance to some type of religious faith undoubtedly would have brought religious warfare, violence, and the Catholic Church would have been more directly involved. And they wanted nothing to do with that. They wanted total independence to rule themselves with no religious interference, no Mongol interference, no one else. Oh yeah. The highest ruling class of the Russian elite was the boyars. The boyars. They assisted the Moscow elite, the princes. They consolidated their power. They helped rebel against the Mongols. And these ruling elite in Moscow would have been referred to as the Muscovites. So we have the greater nobility of the boyars in Russia itself, but then specifically the leadership in Moscow was these Muscovites. They basically hold the same class in society, elite, nobility, just the Muscovites are specifically around the area of Moscow, and boyars are really more in the general area of Western Russia as far as the ruling elite, the nobility. Ivan married the daughter of the last Byzantine emperor, of course, giving him a greater claim to royal authority. Byzantine, the Byzantium was the Eastern Roman Empire, basically what was left over of the Roman Empire, situated outside of Constantinople, also known as Byzantium. And this was what was left after fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. The capital and the leadership of Rome went to Byzantium, and for about the next 1,000 years, basically from the 400s to the 1400s, we see the rule of Eastern Roman Empire known as Byzantium. So the Eastern Roman Empire collapsed. In the 1400s, it was taken over, conquered by the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire finally brought them down after 1,000 years. Well, the last Byzantine empress married the actual leader of Russia. And they took this new title known as Tsar, which was short for Caesar. They became known as czars. And they claimed to be Roman emperors, basically descendants of the Roman emperors. The official date of Byzantium falling was 1453, and I see the only thing I didn't mention there was the Eastern Orthodox Christianity. There had been a split in the Catholic Church 500 years earlier, back around, I don't have the exact date, somewhere around the 10th, 11th century. We'd had a split in the Catholic Church, and we'd end up with a new religious faith known as Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Very similar to Catholicism. But Eastern Orthodox Christianity becomes basically the Church of Byzantium and the Eastern Roman Empire. And it's significant because when the Caesars, the czars, claim they've got they're descendants of the Eastern Roman Empire, the remainder of the Roman Empire, they also sort of adopt the Eastern Roman faith, which is this Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which is at odds with Catholic, and it's also at odds with Protestant. Although it's very similar to Catholic, very similar, because it was the same faith for basically 1,000 years until it does eventually break off and separate itself. See, we have this region of Moscow, we have this area of Moscow, and you see how it grows pretty quickly. 1300, it's the purple. By 1500, it's reddish. Sorry, it's red. By 1500, it's all of this purple, and then it gains these other areas, the blue area. And by 1725, it's gained all this, and really starts to be on its path to becoming, well, eventually, Russia has the greatest land control of any European power. Eventually, Russia becomes greater in size than any other European power as far as controlling land and resources, which is one of the things that makes them so powerful in later years. Quite powerful. When you control all the mines, the forests, the waterways, the trade routes, quite a lot. That image of Ivan Terrible there, that's quite beautiful. When I saw that, I had to put that on there. I had to put that in there. It's just so great. All right, Ivan became Tsar around age 16. He expanded the power of Russia quite quickly. He persecuted his enemies. He created probably the largest multi-ethnic empire in Europe. Absolutely, because it spanned such a huge territory. All of Eastern Europe had Catholics, you had Protestants, you had Eastern Orthodox, you had Muslims, all the way into Eastern Asia, which all kinds of other type of religious faiths. Huge empire. After his wife died, he blamed the boyars who were the ones that were sort of the ruling elite. He blamed them for basically assassinating his wife. I don't know if it's true or not that that happened, but he blamed them for it, and so he spends much of the rest of his life basically persecuting and going after the boyars and trying to assassinate them, try to pretty much wipe them out. He believed they were his enemies, trying to kill him and his family. Quite interesting. Now, warfare, as always happens. Peasants often fled the demands of warlords because they didn't like being turned into serfs. I mean, peasant poor is a rough life in the first place, then you become a serf, and it's practically slavery. And they often joined these warrior bands, which became known as Cossacks. The Cossacks were violent warrior mercenaries and quite skilled. Horse warriors, eastern and southern territories of Russia. Eventually, Ivan forges an alliance with them, an alliance with these Cossacks, and around the 1590s, increases his military strength, his power, his territory as the elite shock troops. They become the leading force in his military. And you can see that on the map. The Cossacks here, added in the 1584, so by the 1590s, this entire region that has the Cossacks becomes part of Russia under Ivan. Following Ivan's death, we see this struggle for power ensues, which is known as this time of troubles following Ivan's death or assassination. It's hard to know something that happened 500 years ago, what it was, but it might have been an assassination as well. A struggle for power ensues, a Cossack rebellion starts, is eventually crushed, and Ivan's nephew, a few great-nephews, something like that. Great-nephew, I think, actually takes over, Michael Romanov. Romanov, he becomes the new Tsar. This starts of a new Imperial Russian family, and we see this massive increase in territory going to the east. Massive, expansive. How massive? Eventually, all of Northern Asia. It takes another century and a half, but eventually pretty much all of Northern Asia, from Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean, falls under the authority of the Russians. It becomes, in this time period, much larger, several times larger than any other country. Timber and land and gold and wealth and water and animal skins and trade routes. It becomes a massive power. This becomes the last official Russian monarchical family, the Romanovs. They rule all the way until the fall of the Russian Empire. Close to 200 years later, the fall of the Russian Empire. The Romanov family does. It's quite interesting. All the natural resources of it. It becomes a true power. Now, the only reason Russia didn't eventually just conquer all of Europe, really, is because of its location. It was far on the eastern edge of Europe, and most of Russia actually was in Asia. So most of Russia's territory and land and population wasn't actually even in Europe. So they couldn't bring all of it to really bear. I mean, they would have had to have marched soldiers 8,000 miles across half the world to get them into Europe. So, while Russia's quite a military power in Europe, they're never ever able to bring their full might of their power to bear just on Europe because of, as I explained. So, all right, we have Peter the Great. Peter the Great comes along. Peter continues to increase the power of the state, strength of the army. He enlists commoners through conscription, forced enlistments. He establishes a regular army. He increases taxes to pay for all these military improvements, forced labor, factories and mines, making peasant life in Russia probably the worst in all of Europe. Probably worse than anything. High mortality rate, working in the mines, working in the cold fields, working in labor camps. It becomes one of the hardest lives to live, to be a peasant, serf in Russia, and one of the shortest lives to live. Now, for most of its history, Russia had always lagged behind the West. The rest of Western Europe lagged in economics, in technology, in culture, and they'd often fallen behind. Basically, the rest of Europe had constant interactions. 360 degrees, constant interactions with other populations, other peoples, religions, technology, science, culture. And what happens when you put more things together, you get more interactions and you get more advances in technology, culture, science, everything. Well, because Russia had been pretty isolated for pretty much its entire history, it never really had much of that. So what Peter wanted to create was an actual modern empire, a modern country that was more comparable with the rest of Europe technologically and culturally. And he does. He really does eventually do this, gaining Western European technology, weapons, government, culture, science, to really reflect modernization. Culturally speaking, Russia was a century or 2 centuries ahead of most of the rest of Europe. He changed that. He basically modernized. He built roads. He built bridges. Not that he built themselves, of course, but he had these things built, increasing technology, weapons, increasing everything. He really brought it into the modern world, this idea of what we would call westernization. He changes everything. He changes the language. He changes the way people talk, how people dress. He changes customs. He really did all of this. He completely changed what we would think of as Russia. He modernized it. He made it a modern European country. Now, He did all this on the backs of the serfs, the slaves, which they weren't slaves, but effectively slaves. He did this on the backs of them. Large death, destruction, forced labor, very small elite ruling aristocracy at the top. Yeah. Basically, they're the ones that did all the work and all the labor building this, what becomes a great empire. That's often the way it happens. We see a mirroring of that in many places in the world, including our own country. In the United States, we see mirroring of that. All right. Section 4. Alternatives to this. We see alternatives in the Dutch. We see alternatives with English. Yeah, we see some alternatives to this type of idea. England and the Netherlands, we see constitutional governments governed by constitutions, laws, elected representatives. Now, usually there's still a king. We still have a king at the top. But we see more actual, like a ruling group of people. We see an actual governmental class. Now, this didn't happen overnight. It takes time. James of Scotland, for instance, ruled for 35 years. He was the kin to the Queen Elizabeth, who was one of the greatest rulers of England. He took the throne. He became king. He antagonized the subjects. The subjects didn't like him. He believed he also had divine right. He didn't really care for the government. He wanted to be, simply put, him and his son, which was Charles, I believe. His son was Charles. Both of them wanted to rule as divine rulers. They couldn't quite get away with it, even to the point of execution, for one of them, even getting executed. They couldn't get away. They tried. They wanted to basically have absolute rule. France, the leaders in France sort of got away with it, sort of quasi. Eastern Europe got away with it completely. And other places in Western Europe, some tried. England, some of the rulers tried, but it was difficult. It was much more challenging. Charles the son, he married a Catholic princess, which of course concerned lots of Protestants, because England was mainly a Protestant nation under the Anglican Church. But of course, now we have Protestant versus Catholics. We have lots of problems there. Charles supported an effort to reform the church in Scotland. He wanted to sort of change the Catholic Church to make it look more Protestant, sort of a Protestantized version of the Catholic Church. The Presbyterian Scots didn't really get along with it. The Presbyterian Scottish people didn't really get along with it. We see a war develop between the Scots, the Scottish, and the English. It gets kind of ugly. Many consider Charles to be a despotic, evil leader. Parliament still existed. Parliament, which was the leading constitutional body who actually ruled through laws and a written constitution going all the way back to the 1200s. Many people believe this taxation was inappropriate. His taxing... He really was trying to rule like an absolute ruler, but there was a government that was installed which limited his power, and he didn't like that. Many people in the Parliament believed that he couldn't get away with this, that he was not ruling with the consent of the population, and many people simply didn't trust him. The Parliament even got to the point of saying he had no authority over the army, that the army actually answered to Parliament, not to the king, which he didn't agree with that, because they knew what would happen. If the authority of the military was somehow fully in the hands of the king, he would have probably forced a actual absolutist government. Heck, might have assassinated might have rounded up and imprisoned or killed all of Parliament. Certainly could have happened. All right. So the House of Commons actually passes a law. An act is a law, a triennial act, and says every 3 years the king must summon Parliament. Forcing the king to actually summon Parliament, and the Parliament can therefore change the laws or policies, restrict the power of the king, and keep the power, ideally, in the hands of the population. Remember the Estates General in France, there was no such rule, there was no such law. The king never had to call the Estates. How bad was it? I don't think I mentioned it, but there was a one period where Louis didn't call the Estates General for 20 years. So for 20 years, he had unrestricted power and authority when no one was able to stop him doing anything he wanted. There's a reason he went basically 40 years of constant warfare. So here, the Triennial Act forced the king to call Parliament every 3 years to actually sort of curb his power and control his authority. It's quite interesting. We have Ireland, which sort of rebelled, and we get this Ireland rebelling, and we get this war, this English Civil War between the Irish Catholics, and the English Protestants. King had no army, the king had no actual power, and Parliament didn't approve it. He wanted to go to war, and Parliament didn't agree with it, so he had nothing he could do. And what he actually does, using his own personal wealth, he flees England and hires his own mercenary army, which is actually pretty big because he was wealthy. He was the king. He had massive amount of wealth. Look like the royalty in England today. They're one of the richest people in the entire world. They're billionaires if you look at them as a whole. So he had all kinds of money. So Parliament won't give him the English military to fight his own little war. So he flees the country and builds his own army. And he goes back and goes against Parliament. Several years of fighting, he loses. He's pretty much fighting Parliament and the actual English army versus his own private army. And the war does last 3 years. So it was significant. It was a real challenge to the power of England. Eventually he's defeated. He actually runs and flees for several years. He is eventually captured, arrested, tried, and convicted of high treason, and executed. This was the official first time that, now royalty had been executed before. There had been royal executions of people who committed high crimes. Usually it was the king that ordered it. This was the first time that a king had been publicly executed. Kings had been killed, they'd been assassinated, but this was the actual English government executing their own king for high crimes against the country, basically against the people. Pretty crazy. They executed him, beheaded him. Now, this sent shockwaves across Europe, because if the country could legally, because this was illegal according to English law, if the country could actually decide, if the people could decide the king was a despot and unjust and criminal, arrest him, try him, and execute him, imagine how scary that would be for the other leaders of Europe, the other absolute leaders in Russia or France or Prussia, Austria, these other absolute rulers who believe that they ruled with the power of God. Think about that. For people who believed in divine right, that these leaders, these kings were chosen by God, and the government of England just killed him. That calls into question all kinds of things. Because if God had chosen the king of England, how could we kill him? How could regular people choose to kill him or execute him or find him guilty of treason? Anyway, it brings a lot of questions to bear, and it sort of shakes the idea of monarchy in Europe, which we do actually start to see decline in the next century. In the 1800s, we do see monarchies start to decline. To the point that, by the 1900s, there's, half of Europe is no longer monarchies. So it does start this eventual decline of many people looking and saying, you know what? Maybe he's just a king. Maybe he's not chosen by God. Maybe he's just a man like you and me, who's been given all kinds of power, but maybe he's not any different than us. Maybe he's really not special. Quite interesting. I don't know if that necessarily gives you an idea of the Scots, the Scottish, the Irish, England. This areas up here were more likely to have Catholics. This was more likely to be mostly Protestant. You can see some of the major battles here in the time period. This gives you an idea of sort of what we're talking about. This was a war that could have been lost by England. The king could have won this. But unfortunately for him, it didn't work out. Okay, so we are going to look at the Puritan Protectorate here. First, we'll start with the philosopher, Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes is a political philosopher. He advocated for a very strong central government, an absolute monarch. There's a snake, is analogy, is that the right term? A snake analogy? The idea that the snake cannot have two heads. There cannot be two heads to the snake. One body, one head, the body being the country and the people, and the head being the monarch, and you can't have them separate. Because if you cut the head off the snake, they both die. The monarchy dies, the body dies. And this idea that it has to be one continuous thing. Therefore, you can't have a country without a king. Simply put, their analogy for that there must be a divine monarch ruler at all times. All right. Now, with that in mind, about this idea of a divine right ruler, we're going to look at Oliver Cromwell's Protectorate. Now, the army defeated the king. King Charles gone, executed. This new government is formed under... Now, initially, when he first died, it was called a Commonwealth. Sort of this Commonwealth government that was of the people. That lasted very briefly. One man, as usually happens whenever there's a power vacuum, someone comes in to take over. Someone rises to the top, and we get this one man who rises to the top, known as Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell. And he calls this, or historians call this, the Protectorate. The Protectorate, to protect England and protect the government, and to protect the divine rule, this belief of divine rule. All right. This was nothing short of a military dictatorship. It's really ironic that the Parliament rises up, executes the king to preserve the Parliament and to preserve the Commonwealth of the people and to preserve the Constitution, and what rises in its stead? A military autocratic dictator. That's irony. That's irony for you. He was a devout Puritan, Anglican, but he was a version of Anglican that was a Puritan. What does it mean? You've probably heard this term many times in your life, the idea of Puritans, because it's spoken a lot about the early Americans, early colonizers. They were Puritans. What were the English version of the Puritans, the original? They wanted to purify the English church to get rid of all elements of Catholicism. Now, the Anglican church was Protestant. It was not considered Catholic. However, if you looked at the entire way it was run, the traditions, the way they dressed, the ceremonies, all of it was Catholic. If you did not know any different and you walked into an Anglican church, you would have probably thought it was Catholic until someone said, oh, this is Anglican. You know, if you're just a common person who wasn't fully versed in all that, like me, I wouldn't know the difference. Because it basically, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, was simply the Catholic Church by another name. Initially, they simply wanted to break away from the Catholic Church, but they kept everything about the Catholic Church. He simply changed his name. What Cromwell wanted was to get rid of all the elements of Catholicism and make it a truly unique and different religious faith. Entirely different. Totally Protestant version of this. Everyone had the right to worship. Everyone had the right to worship, including other religious faiths, except for Catholic. Catholics could not worship in England. He censored the press. He even dismisses Parliament. It gets pretty ugly. He was basically an authoritarian dictator. This eventually leads to a war with Ireland, of course, because Ireland was mostly Catholic. Not all, there was Protestant, but it was mostly Catholic. He took Catholic-owned lands. He tried to shut down any type of Catholic churches. It was a war against the Catholic Church. It was. Ireland responds, actually leading into a war with Ireland. He creates a permanent hatred between the Catholic and the Protestant Church, which existed and basically continued for the rest of England's history. All the way into modern times, all the way into the last century. Constant warfare and conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics, typically Irish Catholics and English Protestants. Warfare, terrorism, violence, bombings, you name it. It's a conflict and an animosity between the Catholics and the Protestants, which pretty much becomes standard fare in England for most of the rest of history, till modern times. It's quite interesting. Permanent animosity to modern times. All right, this is the Leviathan. This is interesting. You have this image here of a king. Again, it's sort of reflective of what we saw with that image before of Louis the 14th? Was it Louis the 14th? Where we have the religious here, the religious scepter, and then you have the military here. So the idea that the king, which in case you can't tell from the image, is full of heads. It's all full of little heads, little people. So basically, all of the people, the king represents the people. The people are the king, and the king represents control over the religious institutions and the civil institutions, military. So all parts of society, all of the estates, even though they didn't necessarily use that term in England, it's the same thing. The idea of the peasants, the nobility, and the church, all together within the king. I mean, it's quite an interesting image, and it really represents this, all ruling over England. It was a version of absolutism. It did not take hold. It collapses. As you can see, I think Cromwell's only in power for 5 years. The English people had said all the way back in the 1200s with the Magna Carta that they were going to have a type of a constitutional government of the people, going all the way back to the 1200s. So this is 400 years later, and we see again someone trying to institute absolute authority. Now, this is, truth be told, this would be expected because most of the rest of Europe had some version of absolute authority. So England was really unique in the fact that it did not. It was certainly the most, we would never use the term democratic. It's not democratic yet, but it was more pushing in that direction than anywhere else in Europe. Any major country in Europe. But there's constantly pull back. For instance, Cromwell trying to push more to that absolute monarchy, which really was still the most common type of governmental body in Europe. It's quite interesting. Puritan occupations. I don't know that this necessarily even matters. I do think it's interesting, though. I know why I left this in here before. In case you're unaware, a surname is a last name. That's your last name, typical, at least along the Western European type thing. Mine's Stacy Kaiser. My last name's Kaiser. Most people in Europe, peasants that didn't have last names, didn't have surnames. Surnames were for proper people, people who had titles and land. So a smith is a person, for instance, who does metalworking, who makes swords, for instance, or plows or whatever. That's a smith. So someone who worked at the smithy would have been simply known as John the Smith, the person who worked in the smith. Or someone who was a porter here. A porter is a person that carries things. So he would have been John the Porter. And of course, over years, that becomes John Smith, John Porter, John Sadler. That's where surnames come in the Western world. Basically, our last names come from what our professions had been. So those names, that's where all those surnames are derived from in the Western world. Western Europe, for instance. England, but it applies to England, France, Spain. It's common. It's interesting. It doesn't really have any actual bearing upon the chapter, really. It's just an interesting sort of thing. Sort of a Jeopardy thing. There you go. All right. Restoration of the English monarchy. All right, the Protectorate collapses, Cromwell dies, a decision was made to restore the monarchy, still with authority and control, with the Parliament being there, but they still believed in a monarchy. They still believed in a king. Again, England has a king and their queen today, but they don't have any real power. They still wanted the monarchy because it made people feel confident. They trusted. They believed there was a proper leader at the top. A very visible person. They just didn't want them to have all absolute power. Parliament enacts the Test Act, which basically denies anyone outside of the Church of England the right to vote. So you have to be Anglican, you have to be Protestant to vote, to hold public office, to preach, to attend, to go to school, to go to university. Basically, you have to be a Protestant to do almost anything, and usually an Anglican to almost anything in England. This is not specifically targeting Catholics, but yeah, Catholics are probably the biggest target, even though it isn't specific. They wanted to get rid of anyone who wasn't specifically Anglican, which, interestingly enough, that also included the Puritans. Cromwell had given the Puritans a very bad name. Most Puritans were not like Cromwell. They didn't believe in this absolute authority necessarily, although they did very, very strongly believe in divine power in God, and the authority of God to make decisions and to have power over our lives. So we do see this actual secret deal made, this actual deal under King Charles, which is made with Catholic France, to where for payments, England would actually start to return to Catholic rule. So, to make that clear again, we have the king, who is Charles. He makes a deal with Catholic France to slowly, secretly return the power of England to Catholicism. So we have publicly, it's very clear under the Test Act, publicly, the Church of England, or probably the government of England, is wanting to push out Catholics, while secretly the actual King of England is actually wanting to bring Catholics back into the government and to try and restore Catholic authority. Because remember, most of Europe is either controlled by or heavily influenced by the Catholic Church. So it's quite interesting how we have publicly the appearance by Parliament that we are going to push away from Catholicism, but the actual king is trying to grow closer to the Catholicism. So we have this disconnect between the governing body of Parliament and the actual monarchical authority. Now, with the new monarch, James II, taking over, this is the next monarch. He was the brother of Charles. He actually begins to appoint Catholics to military offices, to government offices. This scares a lot of people in England who now see a reflection of the French Catholic monarchy across the water there, and they start to really fear that the Catholic power might be again trying to take over England, might be trying to insinuate itself back. You understand there was two things they had a problem with. The actual Catholic faith, lots of issues with the Catholic faith, but historically England had been at odds with France for centuries and would continue to be at odds with them for centuries. Catholic Church and France were the same thing to most English people. Catholicism and being French was both just equally bad. And so anytime you discussed or talked about Catholicism, it would also bring thoughts of France, and which had been age-old enemies. England and France had been at war for centuries, many, many times. So you couldn't separate the two. So hatred of France went hand in hand with hatred of Catholicism with France. And so the idea of returning to Catholicism in England would have been akin to basically welcoming the French in and say, hey, France, take over. And many people would have thought that. Had England actually turned itself back to Catholicism, they would have believed that they would have, next thing you know, the French would have been running the place. Which most English people would have preferred to have died violently than to allow themselves to be controlled by the French. They hated the French. So yeah, it's quite interesting. We see prominent members of Parliament actually secretly offered the throne to Mary, who was Mary of Scotland, and her husband William, to actually offer the throne to them. It's quite interesting. So Mary and her husband, Prince William of Orange, became King and Queen of England after James II fled. England now had the Protestant leaders it wanted. All right, what does all that mean? Mary was Protestant, William was Protestant, and I think they were Scottish. They were from Scotland, yes, Mary of Scots. So what they did, Parliament, this secret action, Parliament secretly offered the kingship and the authority of England to William and Mary. If they got married, they could come over and actually take over England. Having nothing to do with King James. King James was left out of it. Suddenly, King James realizes Parliament's turned against him. William and Mary start coming in, and they bring a military with them. But it's considered a bloodless revolution, a glorious revolution, because once James realizes what's happening, he realizes Parliament doesn't support him. The English people don't support him. English people don't have any interest in being Catholic. He realizes that the people don't support him, Parliament doesn't support him, so he simply runs. He runs, and it's a revolution. One king is kicked out of the throne, not executed, but kicked out of the throne. William and Mary take over, and they're both very devout Protestants. Boom! Finally, England gets the Protestant rulers that it's been wanting for so many years. Truly open, devout Protestant rulers that they've not had for such a long time. And, James flees the country. Quite interesting, this kind of stuff. It's fun to look at it back. If you're actually going through this, it is nothing fun about it. Because who suffers in all this? all the warfare, the violence, all of the atrocities that are committed. While all the royal people are doing all this shuffling around, you've got the peasants that are still toiling away every day under oppressive conditions. Don't get me wrong. Even though they were peasants and they weren't serfs, the life of a peasant was shit. The life of a peasant was rough. Average life expectancy, 30-some years old. Rarely do people live to their 40s and 50s. You worked your whole life. You started working as a peasant when you were a kid, single-digit age. You started working on the farms, the fields, laboring. Almost none had any education. Literacy rates were like 20% in countries like England and France. Life of a peasant was shit. It just was. You literally worked your entire life, you labored your entire life until you simply died. Probably pushing a plow and across a field. That was life of a peasant. So all this stuff going above and above here where all these royalty are doing all their stuff they're doing, you got to consider the life of your regular person didn't really change. All right, so we see this constitutional monarchy. Following the English monarch's attempts at absolute rule, England's decided to create a really more powerful parliament, the parliament which would be comparable to our Congress, what we think of as a Congress today. Parliament's given the power to create all the laws. We see the end of divine rule forever. Divine rule never takes hold again in England. Even though the church is a huge part of English society, the Anglican Church is integral to the monarchy, integral to English society. Nowhere does England ever again, forever, believe that the king is chosen by God or has the power of God. It's quite interesting. The crown becomes secondary to Parliament, and Parliament becomes the ruling power. We do see Catholic restrictions. We do see Catholic population discriminated against. Catholics were forbidden to have weapons, limited. They could worship, but they were limited when they could worship. They were limited to have political office. We don't see a complete disregard for Catholics. We don't see any type of what we think of as a pogrom. A pogrom is basically an extermination campaign to get rid of a people. We don't really see that anymore. By this point in time, Catholics have, they sort of are tolerated as a general population. Not liked, limited power, but they're no longer trying to execute them and eradicate them all or go to war against to kill all of them. Now, John Locke's political philosophy, interesting, it embodies the ideas of what was going on in England at the time. It really does. It sort of embodies the whole problems going on in England. Focuses on inalienable rights, citizen rights, life, liberty, and property. You may have heard the term life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, talking about American government. That doesn't exist, actually. The terminology is life, liberty, and property. Our founding fathers quoted for the Constitution and things like that, the Declaration, they were quoting John Locke. Property was happiness, though. People would have equated property, having land and titles as happiness. You couldn't be happy if you didn't have property. If you didn't have a place to live, you didn't have a home, you didn't have a career, you had to have property. So life, liberty, and property was the happiness part. And he really voiced these ideas and wrote about these ideas of this constitutional government. Why did you need a constitutional government, which is Parliament? Why did you have to have this constitutional government? Because it guaranteed life, liberty, and property. It guaranteed the protections for the citizens. And who were you often protected from? Divine rule and a monarch. That's who was actually you were protected from. These natural rights of man. Believing a representative government was necessary, and a government that oversteps is a tyrannical government, and people have a right, an actual obligation to rebel against that government if it's a tyranny. It's quite ironic if you think about it. This is all what England was arguing for, this idea of rebelling against tyrannical government to establish a constitutional parliament to actually protect the rights of citizens. And then what do the Americans do at the end of this century, the same century? The Americans quote John Locke, saying the tyrannical government is the actual monarchy in England. And, of course, breaking away in what eventually becomes the United States. Quite interesting. All right. Our last thing, which is very brief, we're almost to the end, is colonial expansion in basically America. Colonial expansion into America. You're going to notice in the coming chapters, I rarely actually talk about the United States. It's rare that I'm going to spend any time on that. If you want that, you do an American history course. This is a world history course, which I'm going to focus pretty much on places not what becomes the U.S. I'll talk about the Americas, Canada and Latin America and South America, whatnot, but I'll spend very little time actually talking about what we think of as the United States proper. All right, colonial expansion into the Americas. Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Dutch, they all came here. This was the New World, the new lands. They all came here, and they were almost all business ventures initially. They really came here for profits. They came here for money, for wealth, for profits. It was about that. The colonization of the Americas by Spain, England, France, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the French, almost all economic. It was all economic. It was all about wealth, power, money, increasing markets, bringing goods back to Europe to sell, raw materials, whatever. That's what it was about. Pretty much all of these worldwide expansions were powered for economic and powered by the natural resources that they found. For instance, Jamestown, tobacco. They came here, they started growing tobacco. They found tobacco grew well, and it becomes a massively profitable product, even at one point becoming the fourth largest good in England. Becomes the fourth most traded and expensive and wealth-generating good in the entirety of the English Empire, which spanned, by the late 1700s, literally spanned the world. And tobacco coming out of the Americas was their fourth largest import good. So, yeah, initially they were typically private businesses, small businesses, partnerships. So literally a couple businessmen getting together and buying a ship or two and sailing out, usually often funded by government, to go out and establish trade routes and find new materials to help fuel the government. Quite interesting. Jamestown was Virginia, for instance, very successful colony. The first successful one. Wasn't the first colony, but the first really successful. Most people who worked there were indentured servitude. It's not technically slavery, but you were sort of a slave for those years. You had to sign a contract, and you worked for those years, and at the end of the years, you would be freed from your contract and usually given a little bit of land. Here's the deal. Most people didn't live that long. Most never lived to fulfill their contracts. The vast majority, like 4 out of 5, died before they actually fulfilled their contracts. Plus, if you ever did anything, you ever committed a crime, you ever did something wrong, you could actually have your indentured servitude extended. So the majority of people never actually saw the end of it. They came over here as indentured servants, and the majority of them died as indentured servants. Quite interesting. New England became the colony of the Puritans. We see Puritans coming over. Catholics coming over, the Shakers, the Quakers, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, these places here, these New England communities, often founded by settlers escaping religious persecution in England and Western Europe. The middle colonies, for instance, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, they actually were not originally founded by the English. These were founded by the English, or English people who were leaving, who English people wanted them gone, as I talked about in the previous slide, plus they wanted to leave themselves. They wanted to get out of there. And they came to the Americas looking for freedom, looking for opportunity. The middle colonies were actually typically other colonies by other countries. The Dutch, for instance, I think New York, was the Dutch. They were basically stolen by the English from other European powers. It's interesting there. The French came over. using the St. Lawrence River, which actually went and wound through Canada, into the North America, the central North American continent. The Great Lakes region, they came from Canada, from the Atlantic into Canada. They established a trading empire, a fur trading empire, at nearby what would be Quebec, modern-day Quebec. They were here for the furs. They were here for the animal furs, which were worth their weight in gold. The animal furs, which would be harvested, either traded by the Indians or taken from the Native Americans and then sent back to Europe, and they would be sold, and they were worth their weight in gold. These furs, which would then be worn and formed into clothing for all the rich elites in Western Europe, France, and other Western European countries. These French holdings were known as New France. You'll see this. Let me show it on a map. I think I have it on a map. This idea of New France, which in later years we will call, when it's actually purchased from France in 1803 by Thomas Jefferson, we will call that Louisiana Purchase, which is what most of this is. It becomes part of Louisiana Purchase in many years later. Let's see what else I want to talk about there. France, England, and Spain all had colonial holdings in the Caribbean islands, the Caribbean area. We see sugar plantations. We see the Portuguese doing this in Brazil. African slaves were usually put there. This is actually where the first African slaves were brought. It wasn't to the northern colonies, to what became the English colonies, what become America. The first slaves were brought from Africa for the sugar plantations in the Caribbean and in Brazil by the Portuguese. Portuguese were the very first ones to bring over the African slaves. That doesn't give anyone else off the hook, because everyone else followed suit after that. The French, the British, the Spanish followed suit after that, but the Portuguese were the first ones to do it, to start bringing over the African slaves. And they also, it should be noted, were initially slaves. Initially, those Africans, while they were taken by force, they were brought over as indentured servants at first. And some did work their way to freedom. But within the following century, by the mid-1600s, they become effectively slaves. The indentured servitude, they stopped releasing them. But when they were originally brought over, they were actually modeled on the same type of servitude that the European were brought over, as basically a work contract. And the difference is Europeans usually chose it, although sometimes criminals were sent over who didn't have a choice. But Europeans mostly chose to do the indentured servitude, while Africans did not have that choice. But that lasted for maybe the first century, 14 to 1500s. By the 1600s, they stopped releasing them, and it was slavery. It was people who were enslaved. Very profitable. Also worth its weight in gold. Sugar was. The Dutch came over, took some Spanish lands in the Caribbean, South America. They took part in this Atlantic slave trade as well. Initially, it was Portuguese, but by the mid-late 1700s, the number one country with the slave trade was the British. The British were the English were the ones that controlled the majority of the slave trade by the late 1700s. European powers, in every way, they were looking for military, economic expansion, increasing military power, and no one could stand in their way. All these places they were going were far less technologically advanced. Everywhere they were going, you go into Central and South America, they were still using bows and arrows and spears. Africa, there was many parts of Africa that were still basically in the Stone Age. Even Asia, even Eastern Asia, while you had a few advanced civilizations there, some Indian cultures, some Chinese cultures, which were advanced similarly, actually close to England, most of the rest of Asia was still stone, bows, and arrows. Most of the rest of Asia, especially Southeast Asia, which is where the Dutch, the English, and the Spanish had most of their power. No one could stand against them. These were peoples that were hundreds or even thousands of years behind most Europeans. It was not really they weren't really wars. They were conquests and oppressive, and they were genocide. They're really genocidal. What most of the Europeans did. All right, and that's it. Thanks so much for going through it with me, and we'll see you next time.